Welcome everybody to day 2 of the conference and the first session of today. And this is panel Sociology 2 after Sociology 1 yesterday. What I'm going to do is introduce all 3 speakers now and say a few things about them. And I'm also going to read out their titles of their papers now as well. And then we'll have the 3 papers in order, and then we should have half an hour after those 3 papers for a discussion, question and answers. Okay, so the first paper will be Readings of Marx in Critical Animal Studies, Appraising Traditions and New Directions by Chiara Stefanoni. And let me just say a few words about Chiara, if I can go to the right place, that is, on my second screen. So Chiara holds a master's degree in philosophy and is about to complete her doctoral degree in transcultural studies in humanities at the University of Bergamo in Italy. Her main research interests fall within critical animal studies with particular attention to social and political aspects of the question of the animal, analyzed especially from historical materialist and feminist perspectives. In her doctoral dissertation, Chiara focuses on developing a Marxian-inspired theoretical framework for addressing animal oppression in capitalist societies. In 2019, she was a pre-doctoral visiting researcher at the well-known Center for Animal Ethics at the Pompeu Fabra University of Barcelona in Spain, where we had our last conference. She is a member of the editorial board of the Italian anti-speciesist journal Liberazioni, Rivista di Critica Antispecista. I apologize for the pronunciation. And then our second speaker is Salla Tuomivaara, and her title of her paper will be Animal Appearances in Sociology, Observations on Animals in Sociological Texts from the 19th until 21st Century. And Salla, as many of you will know, is based in Finland. She's a sociologist who defended her PhD dissertation, Searching for the Roots of Exclusion, Animals in the Sociologies of Westermark and Durkheim at the University of Tampere in Finland in 2018. A book based on her doctoral thesis by the same title was published in 2019 by Palgrave Macmillan's Animal Ethics series. And Salla is currently working as a postdoctoral grant-funded researcher on the project Can We Disclose Other Animals? The Challenges of Conceptualizing Animals in Sciences and Arts at the School of History, Culture and Art Studies at the University of Turku. Also in Finland, her research interests include human-animal dualism, posthumanism, history of social sciences, and significance of human-animal boundary. And Salla is the chairperson of the Network for Critical Animal Studies in Finland. And our third and final paper of the session will be by Tereza. And Tereza, even though we've known each other for so long, I always have trouble with your surname, Tereza Vandrovcová, but I know that's probably not quite right. And the title of your paper is Addressing Ethical Bias of Professionals Using Animals. And say a little bit more about Tereza. So Tereza is an academic at the University of New York in Prague, in the Czech Republic, where she teaches social psychology, intro to sociology, and animals and human society, psychological perspectives. In 2011, Tereza published a book called Animal as an Experimental Object, a Sociological Reflection in Czech, and she co-organized the second European Critical Animal Studies Conference in Prague. She was a regional co-director of the Institute for Critical Animal Studies in Europe before EACAS, and in 2015, she co-founded EACAS and the Czech Vegan Society. So Tereza is a big reason why we're all here today. In 2017, she finished her PhD in sociology from the Faculty of Arts at Charles University in Prague with a thesis called Animals as Laboratory Objects, Analysis of the Power Discourse. Okay, so I've got all the titles and introductions out of the way, and now we can move to Chiara and the first paper.
Okay, thanks Richard. Hi everybody, and I'm going to share my screen. Okay, let me see. Okay. So first of all, thanks to the organizers for making this conference possible, even in this online format. And I'm very happy to have the opportunity to share this part of my PhD dissertation with you. And of course, I welcome any feedback at the end of my talk. So let's start. Anti-capitalism is foundational to the field of critical animal studies. Indeed, in the text that can be considered the official founding act of the critical animal studies, that is the manifesto written on the occasion of the establishment of the EACAS in 2007, the appeal to anti-capitalism appears at the first point of the list. And I'm quoting, CAS reject apolitical, conservative, and liberal positions in order to advance an anti-capitalist and more generally a radical anti-hierarchical politics. Given such anti-capitalist commitment, to quote again from Cadworth, sociology has made a most useful contribution in the theorizing of human-animals relations in terms of Marxian influence analysis. Thus, appraising the different Marxist perspective, traditional Marxism, Western Marxism, operaismo and post-operaismo that are adopted often implicitly in the field of CAS is crucial to identify which answers are given to crucial questions. For example, is it possible to achieve animal liberation without moving beyond capitalism? Is animal liberation compatible with capitalism? This is crucial also to evaluate whether these frameworks, these Marxist traditions, can provide a working understanding of the problem of capitalism and animals. A proper understanding of this topic is essential in order to fully address doubts like the ones expressed by human-animal studies scholar and advocate Alasdair Cochrane. He says, and I'm quoting, as well as questioning whether capitalism is the cause of animal exploitation, we must also consider whether capitalism is a necessary impediment to achieving justice for them. For example, it might be argued that there is nothing intrinsically wrong with extracting surplus value from the labor of domesticated animals, so long as those animals are not harmed in the process. As such, capitalism might not be the impediment to justice for animals that some Marxists see it as. So before CAS gave birth to the hybrid marriage between Marxism and animal advocacy, the mutual distrust between the two was proverbial. Indeed, the Oxbridge-style moral philosophy in the vein of Singer and Reagan have little appeal from a Marxist perspective. Moreover, Marx and Engels themselves did not spare derisive words when referring to pro-animal advocates of their time, for example, in the Communist Manifesto. On the other side, the animal rights tradition has devoted little interest to Marx. This comes with no surprise, again, since it is rooted in moral discourse and liberalism. The first essay trying to put together Marx and animals was written in 1988 by British professor, now emeritus of sociology, Ted Benton, under the title Humanism equals Speciesism, Marx on Humans and Animals. Even though no specific tradition of studies on the subject has emerged from this publication, we can say that this article set a trend. In Benton's path, so to say, we can briefly mention almost all the small literature existing on the topic. For example, articles by David Ziebel, Catherine Perlo, Lawrence Wilde, the Manifesto for an Animal Right Left by Charlton Cohen Francione, and more recently, articles by Ryan Gunderson, Corinne Painter, and the work of Jason Heibel. What these essays have in common, from the point of view of the confrontation with Marx's thought, is the absence of any deep conceptualization of what capitalism and capitalist society are. Benton and the others do not even refer to Capital, to the book. They reduce Marx to few scattered citations from the Economic and Philosophical manuscript of 1844. And the core point of this revision is the extension of the concept of alienation and estrangement to animals, to which logically follows the extension of the concept of class. These authors maintain the concept of alienation to be central to Marx's thought, ignoring, willingly or not, the fact that after 1845, This concept surfaced Marx's writings only rarely and vaguely. So seems that these authors are orphans of a coherent and comprehensive, however questionable, interpretation of Marx's theory, from which to start their analysis on animals and capitalism. As I've said, the field of CAS, once emerged, is explicitly committed to anti-capitalism and to Marxian influence sociological analysis of capitalism. Much of the work carried out within this framework is empirically focused on institutions, technologies, practices, media representations, and their interconnection. This kind of analysis do not address the issue of capitalist social formation from a more structural perspective. They work within the so-called animal-industrial complex during empirical analysis. On the other side, when a deeper analysis of how to properly conceptualize animal exploitation in capitalism with the theoretical tools of Marx's critique of political economy is undertaken or attempted, such as in the work of Bob Torres or David Niebert, in their respect holds true the charge of economic reductionism. All these analyses adopt, implicitly or not, a tripartite model of the animal oppression, which is best expressed by David Niebert. First, there is capitalist economic exploitation for the interest of some humans. Then, this power inequality is coded in law, which allows exploitation. And finally, from economic institutions and practices emerges a legitimizing ideology, speciesism, a set of cultural beliefs that inspires discrimination. This way, such accounts show to adhere again implicitly to a traditional account of Marxism and ideology theory, inheriting their shortcomings. Following German Marxist scholar Ingo Elbe's characterization of traditional Marxism, we can say that it represents a close, coherent proletarian worldview and doctrine of the evolution of nature and history, which is based on three pillars. The first one is the ontological determinist tendency with the revolutionary metaphysics of a providential mission of the proletariat. Second, the historicist interpretation of Marx for genetic method, where the sequence of categories, commodity, value, money, capital, is considered to be the description in an abstract terms of actual events occurred in the historical course. And third, the critique of the state, where the state is understood as a mere instrument of the ruling class. It has been proven that traditional Marxism constitutes a deeply flawed and unsuitable account of the social dimension, and mistaken account of capitalist social formation. Therefore, any elaboration of animals in capitalism which somehow relies on it seems bound to fail. As the adjective critical and expression critical animal studies makes clear, the main Marxist reference, however, is not traditional Marxism, but is critical social theory, developed by authors within the so-called Western Marxist tradition. For example, Lukács, Gramsci, Lefebvre, Ernest Bloch, and in particular, Frankfurt scholars Adorno, Horkheimer, and Marcuse. In general terms, what CAS mainly retain from these authors are first the conceptualization of Marx's approach as a critical revolutionary theory of social praxis, and second, the socio-anthropological, psychological investigation of the structural foundation of an irrational society as the capitalist one. At the center of CAS retrieval, there is the theory of domination elaborated in Horkheimer and Adorno's dialectic of enlightenment, which is in turn developed basically drawing on the humanist early works of Marx, again especially with reference to the economical philosophical manuscript of 1844. According to Horkheimer and Adorno, the contemporary society is the apex of a process of civilization to be looked at with terror, as it coincides with a process of unitary and increasingly total domination, and therefore, under the appearance of a continuous progress, stands a process of regression of the human into barbarism. Horkheimer and Adorno's argument sounds in synthesis as follows. Released from instinctual security, from animal immediacy with the environment, and moved by the drive of self-preservation, since prehistorical eras, human beings have always had to choose between their subjugation to nature and its subjugation to the self. The choice has always fallen on the second element of the conjunction, thus showing that the emergence of the human, the anthropogenesis, and the progress of the whole civilization coincides with the process of domination over nature, driven by instrumental reason, which makes it all one with the process of alienation from nature. Human estrangement from nature is fourfold. It is from external nature, which includes animals, from internal nature, that is the animality of the human, which is controlled and domesticated, and it is an estrangement both at the phylogenetic level and at an ontogenetic one. What casts scholars in this tradition fundamentally hold of this argument is the notion of estrangement of nature, and especially the internal one. To quote from Sambo Matsu, it says, the self-estrangement of our own animality. And here again, quoting from the introduction of the anthology that is entitled Critical Theory and Animal Liberation, we can have a glimpse on this idea. Sambo Matsu states, all the contributors to our volume show that the compulsory forgetting and repression of our own animal essence, that is of the knowledge that we human beings are always already caught up with the drama of being animal, prepares the way for the unending catastrophe of modernity. Negation of the animal other is not a side concern to the real issues facing human social life, but the pivot around which our civilization itself has formed. In EACAS scholars of this tradition, the idea of the whole history of civilization as history of domination, a circular progress/regress starting from the domination of nature and animals culminating with capitalism, is interpreted seamlessly. To quote again, of the two modes of life, speciesism and capitalism, speciesism is undoubtedly the more fundamental one. This is not only because domination and control of other species is the precondition for all capital accumulation, but because our species life, our identity as a species, is organized around this dominion. Speciesism, we might say, is the ur-modality or most primordial of all modes of human life, of human productive activity. Simply put, capitalism is the highest form of speciesism. In adopting such a reading, these scholars inherit the problems of Western Marxism as a social theory and its understanding of capitalism. First of all, they adopt a philosophy of history, which is intrinsic to the issue of alienation in Marx. Or better said, they adopt an attempt to think of history in terms of an origin as a presence. In this model of origin, which has been criticized, for example, by Althusser, it is assumed that there is an origin, a starting point, a basis, that at a given time has established history or civilization, and that gradually, with the proceeding of civilization itself, this foundation is concealed and expelled. Therefore, the activity of human becomes an activity of concealment that, in an act of imposture, so to say, comes to cover and hide what it must be recognized as origin and foundation. At this point, there is nothing else to do than looking back and remembering from oblivion what has been concealed and removed, the original foundation, and restore it once and for all. The idea of remembering nature. Second, and relatedly, such an anthropological approach is too abstract, historical, and ultimately asocial, leading to the neglect of the problems of politics and state theory, adopting, generally speaking, a repressive and instrumental theory of the state. And on the other side, it leads to a selective reception of Marx's theory of value and the predominance of a silent orthodoxy concerning the critique of political economy. In the totalizing view of the history of domination, the commodity exchange is merely the historically developed form of instrumental rationality, which has developed in the original process of human self-affirmation, self-estrangement on nature. Therefore, the analysis of the peculiarity of capitalist society and its form of domination and socialization seems to be not even a task.
5 minutes to go. Thank you.
But if we don't understand such specificity, we cannot understand neither the actual form of animal exploitation and domination within capitalist social complexes, its qualitative difference from, say, animal exploitation and domination within feudal societies, and how and why this difference is produced. This way, such accounts fail to draw a clear-cut relation between capitalism and the exploitation of animals. As the aforementioned quotes make clear, such an approach identifies only a quantitative difference and assumes that humankind as a species that is an abstract entity is the never-changing agent of an ever-changing animal exploitation and oppression, and this way miss the structural and qualitative change undergone by animal oppression with the capitalist transition. After all, contra the intention of these authors, from this point of view, it could be possible in principle to obtain the end of speciesism without this having to entail the end of capitalism. If it is a quantitative problem in the current state of affairs, it would be enough in order to end speciesism to remove animals from capitalist production, for example, by producing vegetable substitutes or in vitro meats. So the last Marxist tradition adopted, for example, by Dinesh Vadivel, Agnieszka Kowalski, and Nicole Shukin, work with the conceptual tools coming from the Marxist and post-Marxist current of Italian operaismo and post-operaismo. Operaismo emerged in the 1960s in Italy, challenging traditional Marxism and its orthodox determinism and economism. It criticizes classical workers' movement and left political parties for viewing workers as a mere passive object to be managed. Operaismo puts in place a Copernican inversion, which poses the working class and class struggle as the motor of capitalist development. In this view, capitalism adapts itself to the thrusts and shock produced by the workers' movement and its capability for resistance, modifying its own productive forms. Given this inversion and later post-operaist Antonio Negri's and Michael Hart's reinterpretation of the working class as a boundlessness multitude, it is easy to understand how critical animal studies scholars can gain momentum from such a starting point, which precisely privileges and highlights the capability of resistance and struggle of the oppressed. However, both operaismo and post-operaismo have been convincingly criticized in their account of capitalist society. Thus, again, drawing on their conceptualizations cannot allow to adequately comprehend animal domination within capitalist society. The main shortcomings of these perspectives are about crisis theory on the one hand, and Marx's value theory and the consequent introduction of the notion of immaterial labor on the other one. To put it very briefly, by emphasizing the role of class conflict as the decisive factor for capitalist crisis, post-operaismo not only tends to overestimate contemporary struggles, but also misses the crucial aspects of Marx's theory of crisis. That is, the capitalist mode of production have intrinsic tendency toward crises which are entirely independent of the state of class struggle. And a few words about immaterial labor. Art and Negri rejects Marx's theory of value, drawing on the alleged novelty of immaterial labor. They argue that immaterial, intellectual, communicative, affective, relational forms of production have become hegemonic, and since immaterial aspects of labor products can no longer be measured, the labor theory of value becomes outdated. This claim is clearly based on the orthodox labor theory of value, equating value constituting abstract labor with temporal measurable factory labor, which is uncritically assumed only to be refuted. However, suffice it to say here, quoting from Marxist scholar Michael Heinrich, that Marx's concept of abstract labor is not at all identical with a particular type of labor expenditure, but rather it is a category of social mediation. It aims at a specifically social character of privately expending commodity-producing labor, regardless of whether this commodity is a steel tube or caregiving labor in a nursing home, which is run in capitalist way. And just to conclude with a little glimpse on other possible direction, in my doctoral thesis, I proposed a yet different reading of Marx as a basis to understand the issue of animal within capitalism. I relied on and expanding the so-called Neue Marx-Lektüre, or New Marx reading, that is a cross-school theoretical current which has been originally introduced and developed mainly in West Germany from the mid-1960s by marginal Frankfurt scholars. At the center of this approach stands the Marxian notion of social form and the form genetic method. In this perspective, the critique of political economy uniquely qualifies itself as a critical theory of the constitution of the social complexity in the proper condition of capitalist production. That is an abstract conceptual reconstruction of the structural anatomy of capitalist societies. In my doctoral work, I've tried to demonstrate the necessary emergence of specific social forms of the process of population production as part of the structural anatomy of capitalist societies alongside social forms of use value production. The form of population production ensure livability. They ensure the accumulation of humans, which goes side by side with the accumulation of capital against the destructive tendencies inherent to capitalism toward its own condition of existence. So through the analysis of the transformation of human-animal relation in the transition from pre-capitalist patriarchal pastoral social complexes to capitalist ones, it is possible to argue for the emergence of what I've called an anthropological form that produces population as distinctly human by means of separation from animals. In the pre-capitalist patriarchal pastoral society, the household was the self-sufficient productive nucleus of use value, as well as human and animal population. With the advent of capitalism, this productive unity breaks up and emerges the separation between free wage laborers, human, and the means of production into which the animals fall, that are owned by the money owners and are capitalistically reproduced. So I argue that thanks to this approach, it is possible to focus on qualitative changes and structural constants that are usually obscured by the accentuated continuity and uniformity of the cultural models underlying concepts such as speciesism, anthroparchy, war against animals. And this way, it is possible to prevent a historical, abstract, and dualistic account of animal exploitation in capitalism, and open up truly materialist path of analysis. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chiara, for a really interesting talk. Lots to consider there, and it's I think important to have that critical scrutiny of how Marxist theory has been used within critical animal studies. Okay, we're
You are muted.
I'm sorry. Okay. Thank you very much for that paper, Chiara. I think you missed what I just said, unfortunately, but it was a really important paper. I think we'll come back to that in the discussion. And we're going to move straight away now to the second paper with Salla. Do you need to share your screen?
Yes. Hope you see it now.
Yes.
And, yes, good. Nice to see you all. So it was a very good presentation by Richard. So I'm Salla Tuomivaara, and I'm from the University of Turku, from the Department of European and World History, but sociologist. And so you already heard my theme today. And as Richard mentioned, I'm working at the research project Can We Disclose Other Animals? The Challenges of Conceptualizing Animals in Sciences and Arts. But I'm also doing my personal postdoctoral research on, called Animals and Other Others, Encountering Otherness in Sociology and Anthropology Before and After World War II. So what I'm going to be talking today, it's like involved in both of these research projects. So I'm trying to find out how animals have been told and conceptualized in social sciences. And the root question for my research has been already for years, why animals were excluded from sociology and how did that happen. And my special point of interest for myself is the significance of human-animal boundary, and what is the dichotomy of human-animal boundary needed for. And I'm interested in the process of animalization and how it's used in othering and in creating hierarchies in our society and in all societies. and both in human-animal relationships, but also in human-human relationships. Like Richard said, I already did my doctoral thesis on this same theme. I was looking at the sociological texts from the early period of sociology, and I was especially reading texts of Emil Durkheim, who was the first professor of sociology in France, and texts of Edvard Westermarck, who was the first professor of sociology in England, and also he was originally from Finland. And what I found out was first that animals weren't that excluded from sociology in the early phase of our field. So I tried to find out what those early sociologists did with animals in those texts, how they used animals in their sociological theory construction. And so the common themes that brought animals to texts of both Durkheim and Westermarck was their interest in origins and significance of society, and origins and significance of religion and morality. So at that time, there was this like big interest in the origins of different social institutions. And that meant that we were looking at past societies, at historical societies, and also in other societies, in different kinds of human societies. At that time, they were talking about primitives and savages and so on, but they were like comparing different kinds of societies, past and present. And the idea was that they were like still searching for new ways to explain humans scientifically, and to they were like discussing what are the proper methods for studying human social behavior and human societies. And when we are discussing those questions, it's an essential question. Are we essentially similar with other animals or different from those? So today I'm going to talk about the next phases of sociology. So I'm trying to look at the text from the pre and post World War II era, and try to find out what happened to animals in that period. And this presentation may appear a little bit like fragmentarian, because I'm still like in the early phase. I'm just like trying to find what kinds of animals appear in these sociological and anthropological texts, and after that I can analyze what is happening to animals, and in what ways they really like disappeared from the sociological theory. So today I'm going to give some short examples from these social scientists: Franklin Henry Giddings, Malinowski, Parsons, Elias Boas, Horkheimer and Adorno, and Finnish Rafael Karsten. So all of these texts are from the years between 1922 and 1945, so mainly before and during the Second World War. So first, two anecdotes from early writers Malinowski and Giddings. And Giddings was the first professor of sociology in the United States. And in both of these texts and these quotes, animal life appears as like lower level of life, and compared with human social institutions, which appear like higher level of life. So in preface to Malinowski's famous ethnography on Trobriand Islanders, James G. Fraser writes about animals as a lower form of life, from which all the institutions of special human nature, like of higher order, arise. And this means like sociality and morality and so on. And Giddings himself writes, "These are social feelings and ideas, a human equipment not found full grown, if indeed in rudimentary beginnings in the animal mind." So we are using animals to explain how human social life is a different kind of level of higher social life than animal life is. Then two very different quotes from these two writers. So Malinowski is looking at the killing and eating of animals, which is one of the basic themes that brings animals to social scientific texts. So he writes, when a pig is to be killed, which is a great culinary and festive event, it will be first carried about and shown perhaps in 1 or 2 villages, then roasted alive, the whole village and neighbors enjoying the spectacle and the squeals of the animal. And later we will see an interesting connection to another sociologist here. But Giddings, he has much in common in his style with Edward Westermarck that I have been reading before. Giddings writes the higher animals and man exhibit also sensitivity. Man feels pain, and the higher animals appear to feel it. Man consciously has sensations and memories, and the higher animals seem to have them. Man consciously has ideas, and the higher animals perhaps have a few simple ones. So even though he was like constructing animal life as lower level of life, he's still interested in the similarities in the social life and cognitive features of humans and other animals. And then something more about Franklin Henry Giddings, because he is quite an interesting writer regarding animals. So he uses lots of comparisons between animals and men, between higher animals, so-called higher animals and primitive men. But he also makes an interesting comparison, or a couple of times he compares also plant life to animal life. And he writes that leaving plant organisms out of consideration, the two major kinds of reacting organisms are animals and human beings. So he concentrates on humans and other animals, but he also mentions the life of plants. And he uses lots of references to Charles Darwin's original texts and also to Piotr Kropotkin and his ideas on evolution. Giddings also makes 2 classical statements, that he sees man as a religious animal and man as a political animal. Then talking about 2 sociological anthropological books from 1937 and 1940. Talcott Parsons is a very famous sociologist, as many of you certainly know, and it's very hard to find mentions of discussion of animals in this probably most famous book of him. There are some mentions, like for example, when he discusses Vilfredo Pareto's interest in social Darwinism, he discusses the type of animal societies compared with human societies. And he again mentions that sacredness of the cow when he discusses Max Weber's ideas on religions. But there are very few mentions on animal life or animals in his texts. Whereas Franz Boas is an anthropologist that uses quite a lot of mentions of animals. He writes here, no less are the relations between members of social groups present in animal life, for animal societies of varied structure occur. A considerable field of social phenomena does not by any means belong to man alone, but is shared by the animal world. And the question must be asked, what traits are common to human and animal societies? So still in this 1940s book, he sees that it's essential for sociology or anthropology to discuss how animal societies and human societies are alike. And Boas also writes about other comparisons and about other societies. Finally, sociology, economics, political science, history, and philosophy have found it worthwhile to study conditions found among alien peoples in order to throw light upon our modern social processes. And he also writes on the same page that the methods of comparative psychology are not confined to man alone, and much light may be thrown on human behavior by the study of animals. So he sees that the human-animal comparisons are useful for social sciences. And one basic characteristic that has been seen as very central for Westermarck's theory construction is his aim to understand like common humanity, what's common to all human people, all humans around the world. And it appeared in my doctoral thesis that this kind of aim of not just explaining one culture, but all humanity makes probably animals appear more easily in the sociological texts. And Boas writes, "It's our task to discover among all varieties of human behavior those that are common to all humanity. By a study of the universality and variety of cultures, anthropology may help us to shape the future course of mankind." And then from the 1930s to probably the most famous example of a sociologist, of early sociologist, who writes also about our relationship to animals. And when looking at Norbert Elias, it's interesting that he's explaining current man or current human by looking at the past societies and our history. He writes, "Central to this study are modes of behavior considered typical of Western civilized man. Western man has not always behaved in the manner we are accustomed to regard as typical or as the hallmark of civilized man." So he pays a lot of attention in his theory building to our changing attitudes towards violence, and including violence towards animals. Elias writes quite extensively about hunting and killing, about meat and meat eating, and about different spectacles involving cruelty and killing. One example which has this interesting connection to the text we were seeing from Malinowski, which was like a look on foreign culture. And Elias is looking at our own history. In Paris during the 16th century, it was one of the festive pleasures of Midsummer Day, which is tomorrow, to burn alive 1 or 2 dozen cats. The cats fell into the fire and were burned to death, while the crowd reveled in their caterwauling. So they both pay attention to these other people's ability to feel pleasure on the like seeing cruelty, and hearing
5 minutes, Salla.
And another famous example from Elias is when he writes about our relationship to meat eating and a sight of animal meat. There are even in the gens délicats, people so delicate, to whom the sight of butchers with the bodies of dead animals is distasteful, and others who, from more or less rationally disguised feelings of disgust, refuse to eat meat altogether. And so on, from a standard of feeling by which the sight and carving of a dead animal on the table are actually pleasurable, or at least not at all unpleasant, development leads to another standard by which reminders that the meat dish has something to do with the killing of an animal are avoided to the utmost, and so on. And then the last examples. I already had like some ideas about what might be central reasons for animals to appear, but it's very interesting to look at Horkheimer and Adorno's text, Dialectic of Enlightenment. And I'm also comparing this to another text from the almost same year, which is a Finnish text on general history of sociology. Very different sociological books or philosophical, but what's interesting is that Horkheimer and Adorno raise the development of animal psychology, and Karsten raises the new field of animal sociology, and both say that these are fields that we should be paying more attention to. Horkheimer and Adorno also discuss things like laboratory animals and their use, animal sacrifice, slaughter, and so on. But in general, they also discuss that we should pay attention to the development of animal psychology, and Karsten says the same about animal sociology, which he places as one of the new positive sciences close to sociology in 1945. And other fields he mentions are social psychology, religious studies, and animal sociology. So Horkheimer and Adorno pay attention to this fact that the idea of man in European history is expressed in the way in which he is distinguished from the animal. But after that, they themselves write, the animal's world is devoid of concept, and animals answers to its name, but has no self. But then an interesting part of their writing. For rational beings, however, to feel concern about an irrational creature, meaning animal here, is a futile occupation. Western civilization has left this to women. Woman is not being in her own right a subject. She became the embodiment of the biological function, the image of nature, the subjugation of which constituted that civilization's title to fame. For millennia, men dreamed of acquiring absolute mastery over nature, of converting the cosmos into one immense hunting ground. And Karsten writes, a closer look at animal societies teaches us that many things that when viewed superficially seem specifically human in the light of animal sociology occur as a general socio-psychological phenomenon. And a clear line between instinctive and rational action cannot be drawn. We easily realize that we have less reason to sharply separate the social life of man and that of higher animals. So I just have only very preliminary thoughts on what seems to affect the appearance of animals in the social scientific texts of that era. And those are the object of research. So if we are talking about universal humanity or specific cultures, or if we are talking about modern or primitive, so-called primitive people or past societies, meaning, are we talking about us or others? And others seem to be that object of research which for us makes the animals appear more easily than when we are discussing our own society. And if we use comparisons, they make animals appear more easily than if we see them as unnecessary. And naturally, evolution seen as significant for the study of human social behavior brings also animals to the texts, as also does if humans are seen as essentially similar with other animals. This usually means that also the author pays attention to the other fields research on animals. But then with Horkheimer and Adorno, I started to think that also the critical approach to science and society and attention to power structures, social domination, may be a thing that affects paying attention to animals. So it gives attention to the subjugation of animals, or at least it gives an opportunity for this. So we are like still, I have to wait to see what will be like the later analysis of these texts, but it appears to me that when sociology becomes this like pure modern sociology, it becomes more animal free. And that when we define sociology as the study of our own modern society that does not need comparisons with other cultures or our own past or other species, or neither trying to explain universal humanity, we might lose animals from our side. And also it affects if we believe in the idea that sociology needs only sociological explanations, that we don't have to look at biological or psychological or evolutionary explanations for our human social behavior. And if we see that human society is ontologically different level of reality than animal societies. But also probably critical theory and interest in social domination might bring animals more easily into sociological theory. So those were my very preliminary thoughts on the animals that appear in social scientific texts from the 1920s to 1940s. Thank you.
Thank you, Salla. Really interesting paper, as was the first paper as well. Let's move straight on to paper number 3 with Tereza. If Salla, you could stop sharing.
Sorry.
Yeah, thank you.
Right, can you see everything?
Yes, Tereza, thank you.
Good. So I must apologize at the outset because I woke up with a fever today. So I hope I won't mumble too much. So let us start. One of the goals of the critical animal studies is to eliminate the oppression of animals and to challenge the anthropocentrism of academic knowledge. In order to do so, we need to understand what hinders ending animal use within science, or also in agriculture animal industrial complex. Besides the cultural and economical circumstances of capitalistic society, I believe that we should also focus on the systemic biases of professionals using non-human animals, especially of experts with decision-making powers. These biases strongly affect how these people are dealing with ethical questions related to animals. When discussing animal experimentation in science, its advocates often claim that animal rights activists are too emotional or they are strongly biased, so the arguments don't have to be taken seriously. And it's also believed that it's safe to trust scientists who maintain that using animal models is necessary and the current situation poses no ethical problem. But the research reveals that professionals using animals have strong ethical bias, which is rarely, if ever, reflected upon. Former animal experimenter Barnes, in a book of Peter Singer and Liberation, coined the term conditional ethical blindness based on his own experience with being rewarded for using animals. I would rather use the term bias in order to avoid ableist language. Since the beginning of scientific socialization, people are taught to disregard the use of animals as an ethical issue and to perceive animals as mere tools. So students are repeatedly rewarded for overcoming their innate feelings or disgust and moral doubts by means of peer pressure, authority of teachers, educational institutions, and science itself. So to sum up, there are many broader social circumstances eroding moral responsibility, for example, like bureaucratization of institutions. And we cannot forget also to psychological mechanisms such as objectification and cognitive dissonance, which strongly reinforce the ethical bias. As a part of my dissertation, I've conducted qualitative research with lab workers in the Czech Republic, and I have already presented first raw results in a past critical animal studies conference. And today I would like to focus specifically on the ethical bias of my informants and to provide you some direct quotes to get more detailed picture. Of course, the time is limited, so I will focus only on some areas. I conducted semi-structured interviews with 9 lab workers who were recruited via the snowball method because the official communication channels did not lead to success. Nobody replied to me, so I had to use contacts of my sister because she used to work in the science. This sample consisted of 1 lab technician, 4 PhD candidates, 3 scientists or like leading scientists, and also 1 former scientist whose position is now closer to animal advocates. So what I observed during the interviews, I noticed that most of the lab workers accepted using animal models without questioning, and they believed in its absolute necessity. One supervisor told me, I don't know any alternatives, and I can't imagine that there will ever be one. Nature is powerful, and we will never win. So suggesting that fighting diseases equal using non-humans. So in this way, our respondents construct a discourse of necessity that repeatedly emerges in interviews as an explanation for not only the existence, but also the legitimacy of animal use. I also noticed that most of the informants do not feel the need to find a replacement. As one of the informants told me, I don't think it's a crime at all, suggesting that he does not perceive this animal use as a moral issue. An important source of legitimacy for the use of animals was also the discourse of speciesism and anthropocentrism, which is of course tied to wider social practice and ideologies. This ideology is manifested, for example, by stressing the unacceptability of using human subjects for the same purposes as laboratory animals. I will quote, well, for example, I noticed, one lab technician told me, I noticed on the news this week that in northern Czechia, people, because they are short of work, are having drugs tested on them in the hospitals for a fee, which seems to me to be utter desperation, since they don't know what the consequences will be. So here we see that experiments on informed and paid volunteers seem to have, in line with the ideology mentioned, much worse than experiments on non-human animals carried out without their consent and resulting in certain death. The discourse of speciesism is also closely related to another research question, which concerned the constructed identity of the animals and their interactions with these individuals. So interaction between researchers and animals. When lab workers were asked about their relationship with used animals, they sometimes mentioned that they have a good relationship with them, and almost in the same sentence, they added a strong justification for their using. From the psychological perspective, we could also say that it's their rationalization. I observed that the more positive attitudes toward animals, the stronger the need to justify using them. So respondents who had a reserved or even negative attitudes toward animals did not need a strong justification. For example, 2 supervisors from basic research were openly hard-bitten and claimed that statements like, it's just a mouse, I have never liked rodents, or one was especially interesting, I'm boy from mountains and I know how it looks when rats creep into your greenhouse and eat your peppers, or that rats are pests. So from some of these interviews, I felt as if the informants took the experimentation on rats as some kind of satisfaction or revenge. On the other hand, people with more positive attitudes toward animals need to cope with using them more strongly. So one way how to do that, how to cope with the situation, is to construct an image of anonymous animals whose mission in life is to help science, that their purpose in life. One lab worker described her transformation of acceptance. So I will quote, at first, I thought it was reckless to use animals for experiments, but they're basically born with this faith. They wouldn't even be born. Somehow I got it straight in my head. So she described it like how she cope with it, and she had to cope with it and accept that, because otherwise she wouldn't be able to continue. Consistent with the idea that the more positive attitudes toward animals, the stronger the rationalization, one student responded to the question about what is the aim of her research. So I got a response quoting, "Our goal is development of a new vaccine," end of quote. And what was really surprising to me, that her supervisor from the same research project, and who had much more negative attitude toward mice, told me that they are doing basic research pretty much out of curiosity, and that, quoting, "We do not search for a vaccine. Antibiotics work well," end of quote. Yeah, and there were people from the same research. So, of course, I don't know if the junior researcher really believes it or claimed it just to appear better in my eyes, but we can see that there is at least this needs to justify it. Also, another supervisor who claimed to dislike rats told me that what we find is not applicable because we already have a therapy. So people who were more like this, who felt more distant from animals, were more accepting the research without any doubts. And keeping the distance is quite important. So as sorry, that was the slide from the previous one. Yeah, so this is the quotes of junior researcher and leading researcher from the same project. Yeah. As the interviews have shown, another way to cope was to keep an emotional distance from the animals. Laboratory animals, as we know from the previous research, they are socially constructed even before they enter the lab. By the way, how they are represented in, for example, breeding catalogs, you know, how they are constructed as tools, as helpers, and so on. The previous ethnographic research reveals that scientists using animal models have a tendency to perceive animals as tools and to underestimate the amount of pain animals can experience. But what is also interesting, that this construction, social construction, can be pretty fragile and must be retrieved and maintained in the process of negotiation. One junior researcher told me that how she does that. Yeah, so quoting, if someone comes in, because she was conducting research on animals, so quoting, if someone comes in and says, "Oh, those are nice little mice, and you know, how they have this and that," we forbid them from having that attitude, from gushing over them, because then it makes you feel more sorry for them. I explicitly say, don't gush over them. You know what I'm going to do with them. It's not worth it. Yeah. So and now you know, we can imagine how keeping this distance reinforces ethical bias, because maybe normally they would have this ethical considerations, but they actively keep that down in order to continue with the research. Of course, it's difficult to generalize from a small sample and qualitative research, but as I said, it seems that the more positive attitude to animals they have, the stronger rationalization they need to create and wider distance they need to keep. And I also believe that this tendency gets stronger with the time. And of course, it would be needed, you know, following research. In my sample, in my very small sample, the longer the informants had worked in the institution, the more distant they were from the animals. And as a result, they did not need so strong justification as the PhD candidates, for example. One junior researcher observed this phenomenon by saying, "A lot of people around me don't really think about it anymore. They don't really care. But for me personally, it's important to like keep an idea of what I'm actually doing, or what I'm actually committing, and to keep like wondering if it still makes sense or not. I don't ever want to get used to it completely. To some extent, it's necessary, but again, like I don't want to." End of quote. So although he intends to resist it himself, the question is, how he manages it, or how he will manage it, because this tendency has a quite logical explanation. From psychological point of view, it might be simply a solution of cognitive dissonance. When a person is involved in an activity for a long time, and sometimes it doesn't even have to be a long time, he tends, or she, they tend to align their attitudes with their actions. And here come the rationalizations. So rationalizations are as a result of this process. And when these rationalizations are internalized, it's very difficult to give them up and acknowledge any ethical issues. Now imagine that majority of people who are professionally involved with so-called utility animals, who have undergone scientific, these professionals who have undergone scientific socialization within the natural sciences, and later were involved in using animals in their everyday practice, might have this tendency not to see ethical problems in using non-human animals. So, and these are the same people who decide what research is done, but also how the legislation is set up. And ethical bias is not limited to lab workers. A number of studies have revealed that veterinary students might be less empathetic to animals at the end of their studies than at the beginning. Yeah, so you can imagine like how it can lead to this this cold attitude toward, for example, their patients or animals they take care about. Again, it's important to realize that people with this specific socialization are often members of ethical committees and also governmental bodies related not only to research, but also to agriculture. The public often perceive these people as experts with an objective point of view, but the reality seems to be something else. One of the main aims of this presentation was to raise the profile of this issue and also to encourage other academics to focus on these issues and conduct more research in different institutions where animals are being used and killed. I see an opportunity for critical animal studies scholars to address this problem through the relatively new tendency of European grants to support collaboration between life and social sciences, such as Horizon Europe Framework Program, which is running from 2021 to 2027. And there are already examples worth following, such as this project by Davies and many more colleagues. So that's it from me. These are the resources, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Tereza. What a very rich session, I thought, from firstly Chiara's critique of the uses of Marxist theory in critical animal studies, to Salla's continuation of her historical work looking at sociological thinkers, to Tereza's sociology of scientific knowledge looking at ethical bias within lab workers and potentially veterinary workers as well. So time now for questions and comments. You can use the hand raising or you can type in the chat. It's up to you. Salla?
Hi. I just started to think when Tereza was talking that did you get any new ideas on how could we change that kind of socialization of the lab workers and scientists that use animals? what kind of ideas do you have on that issue? How could
I think the first important step is to reduce using animals in education. Helena Pedersen has a lot of text about it, and I think this is the first important step, because this is like the first time when people accept this, and there's strong peer pressure, and yeah, so once they undo this type of socialization, yeah, so that's the first step. Second step, I think some ethical lectures, or some mandatory courses on these schools which would discuss these ethical issues. They have already like bioethics, but it's often focusing on humans and just partly on the animals, and I think there's a big potential. So I would focus on education. Thank you for the question.
Paula Arcari.
Hi, thanks. Thanks all three. That was really, really thought-provoking. My question's to Tereza again. Was there any sense in your interviews of career repercussions if people did object or refused to carry out or sought non-animal models, or if they even tried to care for the animals in a way that wasn't advised? Like, was there the sense of pressure there and potential damages to their career?
Yes. Younger informants told, I think 2 of them mentioned that at the beginning they didn't want to work with animals and they had this reservation, but they were convinced by the supervisor at school that it's necessary, and it's absolutely nonsense to actually care. So yeah, there was this strong pressure. And I also have stories from my sister who was studying biology, how she was pressured to conduct experiments during her education. So yeah, I felt it a lot there.
Thank you. I think Zipporah is next. Zipporah, you're on mute.
Yes, yeah, thanks. This is a question for Chiara. Thanks so much for the presentation, really interesting to sort of hear about the trajectory of Marxist thought as it relates to critical animal studies. I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on the marginal figures of the Frankfurt School that you feel are perhaps more fruitful resources for critical animal studies.
Okay. Thank you, Zipporah, for the question. It's yeah, this tradition is quite unknown, at least here in Italy and in non-German speaking countries, because also there are not so much translations. There is a very neat and I think useful introduction by Michael Heinrich, and it's an introduction to the 3 volumes of Karl Marx Capitals, and I think that it is most useful because it doesn't understand capitalism as a mere economic system. So I think that there is space, there is room to develop non-reductionist, economicistic interpretation. And it focuses more on the qualitative kind of domination in a capitalist society that is impersonal, and it can help in understanding the kind of socialization that is forced by capitalist production, that is mediated by commodities, and so it helps us to understand this sociological aspect, I think, and I think that there is room for critical animal studies and it's something I try to do in the doctoral dissertation, in understanding the different qualitative kind of organization between the pre-capitalist context and the others, because otherwise I think that we don't understand why we have this quantitative amount of exploitation in capitalist societies if we don't understand what happened in the transition. So the breaks and the breaks of this household as a unity of production. And I used in my dissertation these concepts that are to try to describe these differences. And the idea was that in pre-capitalist, patriarchal, and rural societies, there was a kind of societas, this Latin word with animals. Of course, it was anthropocentric and utilitaristic societas, but the idea was that there was like a communality, a common bond, and so also the population of animals and humans grow together, so to say, because of course the production was orienting towards the needs and the wants of the people, and with the break of these societas, we can see that not only gender relations changing, so for example, with the separation between the private sphere and the economic sphere, but I think that also the fact that human and animals were together, I don't know, there is a separation also in this, because animals now pertain to this new economic sphere that is separated from the reproduction of humans. And yeah, this is some original idea that I had, but I think that in order to understand capitalist society, the new Marx reading is very accurate, because it's quite complex actually, but as a very correct understanding of value theory, I think. So thanks for the question, and this is an invitation to read more about. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I mean, I might ask a question if that would be allowed. I feel I could probably ask a question to Chiara and Salla, and maybe also Tereza, but I will ask one of Chiara. I really appreciated your paper because I think I felt for a long time that maybe the uses of Marxist theory within critical animal studies has lacked a lot of nuance and depth, which isn't to say that that work has also not been useful. I recently, in the last few years, have really liked the work of Jason Moore, and I'm talking about his two papers from the Journal of Peasant Studies about the Capitalocene concept. And I like it partly because of his deeper historicization of the development of capitalism, and also he's influenced by folks like Federici and ecofeminism more generally. And he's very careful to avoid economic reductionism, for example, and he's even quite attentive to species as well. So I'm just wondering, I'm just curious actually if you have any, if you've read that Jason Moore work and whether you have any views upon it.
Okay, so thanks, Richard. To be honest, of course, I've heard of Jason works, and I've read some secondary literature, but I haven't read the two papers you've mentioned. I think that the main clash here between his view and the one of the new Marx reading is again on labor, on value theory, because the idea of this new Marx reading is that value is not produced by so to say, the expenditure of mass souls. It's not something that is substantial, but is they say it is a relation of a context of mediation. So they think that value is produced only in the exchange. So there is no value in the process, but only if the product is exchanged, then there is value. So maybe the main difference is on this point, but this point, I mean, I'm not an economist, so I'm not have the proper tool to address it, but I think that the main clash is on this side, and but I'm going to read more about Jason more works. And of course, I think that the idea of capitalocene is powerful because and it's and something we have to take into account, and maybe it's preferable better than Anthropocene, I think.
Yeah, he has a huge focus on the crisis tendencies of capitalism in his work as well, which is, I think, important.
Yeah.
Thank you. Does anybody else have, we still have nearly 10 minutes. Anybody else has a question or comment?
Chiara and Zipporah are raised their heads.
Oh, sorry, no.
I think it's still up from before. Yeah.
No, actually, I have a question for Tereza, because I don't know, what do you think about people, young researchers that cannot bear these ethical blindness, so to say, and they drop out? Because recently in the journal that I am in the editorial board, we have like a diary of a former researcher that was against the experiment. And there is a quote from her, and she says, "I understood that I couldn't put in discussion animal experimentation without putting into question the entire system of science." So she dropped out, and she came to question the entire system, because probably the socialization, as you said, is very forcing.
Yeah, so personally I understand that, because since they cannot cope with that and they just leave, but of course I think the better solution is to stay in the science and try to push alternative methods and from inside, because once they leave the system, also I asked my participants about what they think about critical opposition who are not scientists, for example, and they were so strongly their attitude was very, very negative, and they had very distorted view of their arguments. So I think it will be better, but I understand them.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question in reserve, but I will try to be a nice chair and ask if anybody else has one first. Okay. So my question is for Salla, and maybe it's, yeah, we all like the cat in the background of Tereza's. Thank you, Kadri. Question for Salla. Really glad you're looking at Elias. I think I used Elias for a long time now in I guess in probably quite a superficial way, but even like probably going back to my PhD, because of the content that you covered actually, and there's obvious usefulness there, isn't there, in terms of using Elias for critical animal studies. But I think he's really maybe overlooked, because maybe one of the first people to historicize the human in that way, and to relativize the question of the human and how it has changed, how it has changed over time, and the civilizing process, and the distancing from this notion, this confused notion of the animal. Just wondered if you had anything further to add on that.
Yeah, I agree with you. I have also been reading Elias since my master's thesis, and he's really interesting, because when you think that he has been writing in that book in 1930s, and he sees so clearly this process, how our relationship to violence towards animals has changed, and how that means also that our idea of humanity and how we should like behave ourselves as humans, what should be like proper humanity, because he sees it so clearly what is like really happening, and what is going to happen, because he says that he believes that we are going to be even more critical towards fox hunting and so on, and we are going to be eating animals in even more like processed ways, and not seeing the animal origins of it. And at the same time, he also discusses that the violence still happens, but it's so important for us to like hide it, and to like, he always talks about this like hiding stuff in the like, how do you, in the curtains, or like not to see it, that's like more important for our like human civilized behavior than not doing violence, is to like hide it from the side. So I also think that it's really interesting how he like historized that relationship between like our relationship to violence and animality, and our whole like manners and how it changes. Yeah.
I wonder how he would conceptualize critical animal studies. Or are we part of the historical process of the civilizing process? Not that I'm, not that I'm claiming civilized in that, bracketing that word as incredibly problematic, but in terms of trying to push society further away from violent practices, and whether he would fit critical animal studies and the animal rights vegan movement as a further part of that trajectory, that historical trajectory.
Yeah, I see it that way. Of course, it's like much more like difficult to talk about that when we look at the different continents and different religions and cultures. But clearly, Elias sees something like very interesting, what's happening in like so-called Western societies, especially. Of course, he writes also about like China and how the similar kind of changes have happened there. But yes, I don't think that it's like a universal phenomenon, that it would happen like in the similar ways in different parts of the world. But in Europe, he's like looking, he has found some kind of like process that really seems to be happening. And I see that critical animal studies is part of the same change. That's like he's looking back to like from the Middle Ages, and then we had the rise of the animal protectionist ideas in the 19th century and so on. So I see it that way.
Yeah, and of course there's lots of counter arguments to that as well. Counter arguments which would want to critique a linear idea of history, and also to point out that there's more violence against animals today than there ever has been, and so on, and violence towards other human beings as well.
Yeah, and I think that's one of his strengths, because he doesn't say that we are getting less and less violent, because also what's happening in Germany at that time and so on. But he's like exactly looking at that process where we change our attitude towards open violence, not like that we would come like better persons all the time, but.
Thank you very much. I think, so we're actually at 11 o'clock now. So it's time to take a break. I'm going to stop the recording now.